This is yet another case of where we have terms from the physical world making their way into technology. And analogous to a honeypot in an information system is a honey trap as a means of enticing a person into a situation that they probably shouldn't be getting themselves into. So for example, by the definition here, a honey trap may involve using a particularly attractive, enticing individual in order to see if someone else, the actual target, would succumb to their charms and thus demonstrate infidelity. There's probably a degree of entrapment there as well, but clearly the intention is to try and establish whether there may be some suspicious intent going on. And in fact, that's a good segue through to Honeypot as an information security system. Let's go and define Honeypot specifically. This is a pretty simple definition because a honeypot really is a pretty simple device. It sits there on a network waiting for people to connect. That's its entire value. It's not there filtering traffic or applying any rules or otherwise controlling the flow of requests across a network. It just sits there, looking attractive and waiting to be probed, attacked, or compromised. Now, the value proposition of a honeypot is that it's a device that wouldn't normally be used in the normal operations within an organization. So for example, nobody should be transferring files backwards and forwards or telnetting into it or having any other form of interactivity with it. So when it does see interactivity, it knows that that may be something suspicious. And what honeypots will generally do is log that activity and alert an administrator. So let someone know that it's being probed, that a potential attacker is possibly browsing around it. So this becomes an early warning system. Hey, there's someone in the network probing around. They're probing a device that really shouldn't be probed at all. This is something which might require further investigation. Let's move on and have a look at how a honeypot might fit into a network and the sorts of behaviors it might exhibit in order to lure an attacker into it. A honeypot serves no legitimate purpose on a network. It's not serving files or running applications. It doesn't do anything else other than to sit there and wait for a potential attacker to come by. When that attacker does visit the honeypot, information about them is collected. So an obvious attribute that you'd collect is the IP address. Where is the attacker coming from? Are they somewhere within our network? Could it possibly indicate that there's a compromised machine somewhere? But what is it about the honeypot that makes it so attractive to an attacker? Let's look at some of the roles that a honeypot could play. And one of them is it might appear to be an old operating system. Now we'll talk about different types of honeypot in a moment. They can be dedicated devices that certainly are not old operating systems, or they can indeed be machines that are specifically configured to be vulnerable and are then monitored for suspicious activity. So it may or may not actually be an old operating system. But that doesn't matter because it only has to look like it. It has to be attractive enough for the attacker to connect to it. Another very attractive thing within networks is outdated web servers. Attackers know that outdated web servers often have pretty well-established vulnerabilities. An attacker in a network seeing, say, IIS-5 would be quite excited by the potential to extract valuable data from it. Same again with unpatched servers. And these are precisely the sorts of things that an attacker looks for on a network. They want to find vulnerabilities in environments. And servers that haven't had critical updates applied to it are pretty attractive. If a honeypot is sitting out there appearing to be a server that may be at risk of attacks that an adversary could easily mount against it, that's the sort of target they're going to want to take a look at. Beyond operating systems and servers, there's also the premise of things like enticing files, payroll.xls, passwords.txt. Files like that sitting on a honeypot are going to be exactly the sorts of things that attackers want to connect to. So you see how all these points appear very attractive. They're exactly the sorts of things someone would look for when they're browsing around the network trying to find something of value. For example, an attacker is often going to want to see if port 80 is open. Is it actually running a web server? Could there be valuable files on there? Connections to a honeypot over port 80, when there is absolutely no reason to be connecting to that machine, could well be a very early indicator of compromise. Now, very often, you'll see a honeypot sitting within an internal network. So it'll sit in there amongst all the other servers and PCs and switches and other equipment that a typical organization has. So for all intents and purposes, it just looks like an organic part of the network. An attacker connecting to that network is not going to be able to distinguish the difference between legitimate machines and a honeypot. There are some observable behaviors which might tip them off, and we'll talk about those as we progress through the module. But certainly the intention is that it sits in that network and it looks legitimate. Now think back to a moment to the earlier examples in the first module, the examples about Sony Pictures and Ashley Madison. Sony allegedly had attackers in their network for a year before they actually discovered what was going on. If there was a honeypot in there, and the attackers browsed around and took a look at it because it contained one of the sorts of things that we see here, how much earlier might Sony have identified that attack? It wouldn't have stopped it, of course. This is after the attacker is already in the internal network. But it might have made the difference between exfiltrating the huge volume of data they eventually did and a much smaller volume. It could have mitigated the risk and reduced the impact. But that's an important point. Honeypots aren't there to stop an attacker getting in the first place, not like a firewall would. They're there in addition to the firewall, so that if an attacker does actually gain access to the network, so for example, they've successfully evaded the firewall using one of the techniques we discussed earlier, then the honeypot provides the early warning. Hey, we couldn't stop someone getting in, but we've discovered it early. So this would be pretty typical for an internal network, but honeypots could also exist in the external network, so publicly facing. So for example, we could have honeypots sitting out there posing as industrial control systems. We're going to look specifically at some examples of that a little bit later on in the module. The point is that a honeypot could sit out there facing the public net as well. It's not just an internal only device. Of course, they're usually set up to emulate different sorts of devices internally to what they would externally, but certainly you could see them exist in either location. Let's go and take a look at a real example of this. Let's check out Project Honeypot. This is Project Honeypot, and it's a spam honeypot. So it's not looking for attackers who want to access sensitive files or connect to potentially vulnerable ports. It's looking for things like crawlers that will wander around the internet, siphon up email addresses, and then send spam. Now what it's really trying to do is identify the sources of spam, and it does this by scattering email addresses around the web. Very specific email addresses which can then be monitored by Project Honeypot. And then when email is sent to those addresses, it can identify the sender as a spammer because they've gone and just siphoned up the addresses and have sent unsolicited mail. Now you can see here in the project statistics just how large this is. It's monitoring 226 million email addresses as of the time of recording. And in fact, it's picked up about 250,000 harvesters. So this is resources that are going around obtaining these addresses for the purposes of spam. You'll get a bit more of an idea about what this project does when we look at the statistics. Here's some really interesting stats, and this helps you understand the mechanism of Project Honeypot. Keeping in mind that it's scattering these email addresses out there on the web, very specific email addresses that it can monitor, what they're finding is that on average, it's taking 2 weeks and 5 days between putting those addresses out there and then starting to receive spam. It can then identify the IP addresses that are responsible for this and also identify where they're coming from as well. Now what all this means is that Project Honeypot is really useful for building spam blacklists. Because those email addresses are the honeypot, they're the trap, it knows that IP addresses sending mail to them are likely to be malicious. So once this actually contributes into blacklists, if mail servers using those blacklists see email coming from those IP addresses, it can have a high degree of confidence that the email is going to be spam. So this is one very specific implementation of a honeypot. It's an email address honeypot. Put the addresses out there and then see who grabs them and starts sending email. Let's move on and talk about a couple of key different types of honeypot. You'll usually see a honeypot being referred to as one of two different types. One is low interaction and the other is high interaction. Let's take a moment to define these. When we talk about low interaction, we're talking about emulation of attractive services. Now that word is important, emulate. It's not that the server is actually running, say, SMB, the server message block, which is used for accessing files. It just has to look like that. So a honeypot can be configured to emulate the behavior of SMB, FTP, or pretty much any other protocol you can think of on a network. It doesn't have to actually stand those services up and have them run in an interactive fashion. That is, say in the case of SMB, you don't need to actually be able to move files across it. It just has to look attractive enough that an attacker attempts to. It can fail, it can drop out. It doesn't have to be able to send the file. So long as it can log the attempt to do it, then the honeypot has served its purpose. But it's low interaction because it doesn't actually work. The focus of a low interaction honeypot is on collecting these probes from the attackers. Let's see who's trying to connect to this thing. What are they trying to do? Once we have their attempt to connect, and we have information such as where that attacker is coming from, then the low interaction honeypot has served its purpose. Now, one of the upsides of a low interaction honeypot is it's not going to be compromisable, at least not via any of these protocols, because it doesn't actually implement them properly. It just looks like it does. It mimics the behavior. What this means is that honeypots can be stood out there on the network, sitting there looking like things like file shares, without the risk of them actually being compromised. We'll look at an example of one specific product a little bit later on in this module. Now, by the same token, because a low interaction honeypot doesn't actually behave like the service that it's emulating, they're also easier to identify as a honeypot. For example, if an attacker does see a file share and they can't genuinely pull files from it or write files to it, it starts to look pretty suspicious. But by the same token, it may not even matter. And we'll talk about this more when we get into evasion techniques. But the honeypot is not there to try and behave exactly like the server it's emulating. It's simply there to see if an attacker connects to it. Now, once they've done that, regardless of whether they can actually do anything useful, the honeypot has really served its purpose. It can now flag that there was a connection attempt. Now, all of this is quite different to a high interaction honeypot. And the main reason is because a high interaction honeypot can actually behave like the thing that it appears to be. So in other words, it adheres to behavioral norms. You would be able to read files from it, or write files to it, or do whatever else it looks like you should be able to do. In many cases, this will actually be the machine that it's emulating. The main difference is, when it's a honeypot, it needs to be able to collect information for forensic purposes. So for example, it might be a genuine Windows server, but it also logs keystrokes somewhere centrally. It might also implement controls that makes it difficult for an attacker to cover their tracks. Very frequently, that's something an adversary will want to do. They'll want to clean up after themselves. And as much as we want a high interaction honeypot to behave like a real machine, we also need to collect attacker behaviors. Now, a high interaction honeypot may also be part of what we would call a honeynet. And a honeynet can be a collection of machines that's actually emulating a genuine network. So for example, it may have web servers and database servers and file servers. And these may all very well just be virtual machines. They don't have to be physical machines on the network. They just have to look legitimate. Now clearly in something like a honeynet, it's going to be a much more complex environment. It's no longer just one machine that's a honeypot sitting within a genuine network. We're now talking about most likely an isolated subnet containing multiple machines exhibiting this standard network behavior. And the main thing here is that attackers can actually interact with it. The more normal it looks, the more the attacker can be enticed into moving around the network in an observable fashion. And that's really the key. We want to collect this data. We want to understand, how does an attacker move around this environment? And this is really the value proposition of the high interaction honeypot. It looks legitimate enough that an attacker is going to move around it just as though they're in a real network. And all of this, of course, also makes it harder to identify as a honeypot, because not only does it look like a legitimate machine, but it behaves like one too. So that's two different classes of honeypot. Let's go and have a look at a very popular open source example of a low interaction honeypot. HoneyD is an open source honeypot project that dates all the way back to 2003. As I just mentioned, it's a low interaction honeypot, so it merely emulates behaviors of the network stack. And as you can see here, it can be used to create virtual hosts on the network. Now, each one of those hosts can be configured to support various protocols. So for example, you might stand HoneyD up to appear to accept telnet connections. And then, as we've discussed so far already in this module, it just sits there, waiting for an attacker to attempt to telnet into it. The attacker can't actually telnet into it. It wouldn't really be running the service. It just has to appear to. So this is the low interaction emulation of the service. Now, this is a very popular, very straightforward implementation. Let's now move on and look at a commercial model that's becoming very popular in recent times, and that's Canary. This is Canary, a dedicated turnkey honeypot device, an actual physical device, created by Thinkst, who are based in South Africa. Canary has become a really successful tool because of how easy it is to implement. So I thought we'd take just a few minutes to run through it and explain what it does, because it's a really good example of a low interaction honeypot, and it demonstrates the exact value proposition of why these make sense in a network. Let's take a closer look at what Canary does. Earlier on, I mentioned the canary in the coal mine analogy. And the legend here is that this dates back to a time when coal mines didn't have ventilation systems. The risk of an unventilated coal mine is that you have the potential for noxious gases like methane and carbon dioxide to build up, potentially lethal gases. And the theory goes that canaries were especially sensitive to these gases. So you'd put a canary in the coal mine, and so long as the canary keeps singing, then the miners know that everything's okay. As soon as the canary starts to look a bit sick, you know that there's going to be a problem. What we're looking at here is the digital equivalent of the canary in the coal mine. It's a device that you put within the network, and as soon as it chirps, you know that there might be a problem. This is just a small Ethernet connected device, and indeed you might actually have many of them within one network, each one of them emulating a different device which looks attractive to an attacker. However, they're not really that device. They're a low interaction honeypot, and when the attacker connects to it, then that's the canary chirping. Let's take a look at how they're configured and run. This is a great way of visualizing how a canary can behave like another device. And it's interesting to have a look at the device personalities that we see here. So for example, would you like your canary to be a disk station NAS? So this would be a Synology device. You can imagine that network attached storage is exactly the sort of thing that an attacker wants to connect to. But alternatively, it could behave like a Dell switch. Now, a Dell switch is a fundamentally different device to a NAS appliance, but that doesn't matter because they're low interaction. They just simply need to emulate the behavior. We've obviously then got a bunch of Windows file shares and even a Cisco router. And again, so long as each one of these devices can actually emulate what an attacker would expect to see when they were connecting to, say, a Cisco router, then that's enough. Now the canary behaves just like that device, yet it's obviously a honeypot. Let's go and have a look at what the attacker actually sees when the canary is configured as a Cisco router. Here's an Nmap probe on a canary, and everything we see here suggests that it is genuinely a Cisco router. Now this is not just the ports that are open and the banner that it's returning. It even goes all the way down to the MAC address, which would be a genuine MAC address from Cisco systems. Tools like Nmap are the bread and butter of attackers looking for vulnerabilities within a network. If they're simply port scanning an environment and they get a response like this, they're going to draw the conclusion that it is exactly what it looks like. Yet, as soon as they hit that device, that's it. The Canary is going to record the incident and it's going to now appear in the management console. Let me show you what that looks like. So here's the alert, and we can see here that there was a Telnet login attempt against that device. Now this dashboard is showing that there is one Canary currently enrolled. And the way Thinkst creates this tool is that you may have multiple Canaries within an environment, and then you'd see each one of them here in your dashboard. Understanding that someone has attempted to connect to this, and not just connect to it, but actually log in via Telnet, is one thing. But what you really want to know is more about who or what was trying to do that. Because ultimately, the whole point of the honeypot is to try and identify attackers within the network. Let's take a look at what we can find out about who connected to this. So here's the Telnet login attempt. And everything you see here is pretty self-explanatory. So obviously it's timestamped, but we also get to see the source IP. And this is what's going to be really interesting to the administrator maintaining the Canary. The first thing they're going to want to do is figure out what's going on at that source IP address. It's possible that the connection wasn't malicious, but a well-configured honeypot is going to be stood up such that there shouldn't be organic natural traffic going to it. But particularly as you look at the additional details, and you can see that someone is trying to log in with the username admin, then that would be a bit of a red flag. You'd certainly want to spend a bit of time investigating precisely what's going on at that source IP address. One final neat thing about Canary is the way it can integrate with different environments. So here we're seeing it appear in Slack, and Canary can also integrate with things like webhooks. So what if you'd like to create a programmatic event when activity is observed on the Canary? That may mean logging a ticket in a support system, or raising other alerts such that administrators can get onto the issue as fast as possible and investigate what's going on. Now again, think back to that first module about Sony and Ashley Madison. If they had a bunch of Canary honeypots scattered around through the network, each one possibly standing up different services, emulating different devices like we saw just before. If there's an attacker moving around laterally within that network, trying to discover the machines that are in there, the services that are running, the files they might be able to obtain, one hit on one Canary could have been enough to significantly reduce the impact of those incidents. Not stop them altogether, because the attacker was already in the network, but certainly have a major impact on how successful those attacks ultimately were. I want to have a look at one other Canary-related resource, and that's Canary tokens. Canary tokens are created by the same folks that make the low-interaction Canary honeypot that we just saw. The thing is though, Canary tokens are entirely free, and they are nothing more than a token. They're just a unique string. Now these may sometimes also be referred to as honey tokens, and I want to show you how they work. What I'm going to do is enter my email address, and then what I'm going to do is create a comment that's going to explain where I'm actually using this token. So what we're ultimately trying to do here is to create a unique string that we're going to embed somewhere. And then if someone accesses that location, I'm going to get a notification. So let's give it a hypothetical comment. Let's say, saved in payroll.txt on the accounts file share. So this is a message where if I read it sometime in the future, it's going to make sense to me. Let's now generate the token. Your Canary token is live. Now if I scroll down a little bit, we'll see some different ways that we can use the token. So for example, it can be embedded into a Word document, and if someone opens the Word document, it will automatically make an HTTP request to Canary tokens, which will then result in me getting a notification at my email address. We could do the same with PDF, and there's a couple of other options here as well in order to embed that token in places that attackers might probe. I'm going to have a look at this option just here, the web bugs option. And what we might do is put this unique URL in, say, an email. Or as it suggests here, possibly even put it into a web page that's only found through brute force. So a page that nobody should ever visit under normal circumstances. But per my comment earlier on, in our hypothetical situation, this is going to exist in a text document. Now there are a few different ways that we can represent this URL. The main thing is that this unique token has to exist in the address. You can see the token as part of this unique URL just here. Let's just keep it simple though and have a look at what happens if we visit this URL. So we don't actually see anything here in the user interface, but if I now go to my email, here's what I have. This is my little canary singing, my little canary token at least singing. So I'm getting an email as soon as someone hits that URL. There's the comment I left earlier on. So if I'm receiving this months from now, I can remember where I actually used the token. Here's my IP address, or at least the IP address of my VPN provider, and a bit of information about the user agent as well. Now this is obviously a really simple implementation. It's by no means a sophisticated low interaction honeypot. It's just a unique URL that causes an email address to be sent to me when someone makes a request to it. But going back to the premise of a honeypot as an early warning system that's simply there to raise alerts when something is accessed that should not be, this is a very simple, albeit completely analogous example of that. So that's the low interaction Canary honeypot and Canary tokens. Both good examples of how a honeypot can work. Let's now move on and talk about detecting honeypots. Detecting honeypots is somewhat of a paradox. Let me explain. To begin with, an attacker really needs to probe the honeypot in order to figure out what it is. So think about how they would normally identify what any other machine on the network is. We just looked at a screen grab from Nmap when we're looking at Canary. That's the sort of tools they want to use in order to fingerprint machines. But of course, that is exactly what the honeypot is waiting for. It's sitting there, waiting for someone potentially malicious to connect to it. So the very first phase of detecting what any device on the network is the very activity which can trigger a honeypot alert. Now some people will say, well, a honeypot is designed to be very enticing. If you see a machine on the network that looks like a really easy target, then it could well be a trap. That might be a honeypot. Except the problem is there are so many easy targets on so many networks that alone is not sufficient criteria. Because it might be a honeypot, or it might just be a typically poorly secured box on that particular network. Detection without triggering an alert isn't easy. And for those running honeypots who may be concerned about the fact that it could actually be detected as being a honeypot, the Canary team have this to say. This is kind of what I just touched on. The very interrogation process that's required to figure out whether the device is a honeypot or not is exactly the sort of activity that you're looking for on the network when you run a honeypot. And that's great because now you can go and investigate further. Now you know that someone is probing something that shouldn't be probed. So that's the paradox of detection. Now, having said that, there are a few other ways of identifying honeypots on a network. Let's have a look at those. There are a number of honeypot behaviors which can be observed, and we're going to talk about how they can be internally observed. So once you're actually in the machine, you're connected to it, and also how they can be externally observed. So observations that can be made before actually connecting to it and then consequently triggering an alert. Now internally, a honeypot is going to be designed in a very specific way, and often it'll look like the thing was just set up. And hey, what a surprise, there's all these enticing looking files scattered all over it. What are the chances of that happening? Now again, to my previous point, That's not completely unusual in many networks to have really poorly secured environments. But that brand new machine feeling as well is just a little bit too suspicious. Another giveaway can be how drives and devices on the machine actually behave. Keeping in mind that particularly a low interaction honeypot is simply an emulation, you're unlikely to see the same behavior of what should be physical assets within the machine when you're connecting to a honeypot. Same again with drivers. So one example is something like the name of a mouse driver. If that's in a dedicated honeypot, oftentimes it's going to be different to what you would see in a legitimate machine. Now, on the other hand, think about the externally observable attributes of a honeypot. So now we're talking about things that you may be able to see without actually connecting to it. So one would be a lack of normal outbound traffic. Honeypots don't communicate in the same way as legitimate servers. They're going to have very different traffic patterns. And if you're in a position to observe that traffic without actually connecting into the machine, then abnormal behavior is something that you may be able to identify without triggering an alert. Finding just a lone machine sitting in a DMZ or a subnet would be another giveaway. That is not a normal pattern. Now, it's worth noting that these are not absolutes either. You could possibly have a single machine sitting there in a DMZ. So this rule is certainly not going to give you absolute positivity about the nature of the device. But something like this, or the previously mentioned abnormal traffic, tends to be an indicator. It's not emphatic, but it is a bit of a sign. And finally, honeypot or not. There are services which can identify whether machines facing the public internet are legitimate machines or are simply sitting there to entice people into it. Let me show you what I mean. This is the Honeypot or Not service, and it's a service run by Shodan, a search engine for internet-connected things. I've talked about Shodan in some of my other courses in the past as well, because it has some amazing insights into the things that exist on the internet. Because Shodan does scan such a huge portion of the internet, and it's indexed so many different machines and devices, it's in a great position to report on whether one of those might actually be a honeypot or not. Let me show you what I mean. I'm going to enter an IP address that I might be interested in. Let's try this one. And we will check for honeypot. Honeypot found. According to Shodan, this IP address is likely a honeypot. As it says in the FAQs further down the page, it does this by looking at the defining characteristics of known honeypots. And inevitably, Shodan does that by probing those devices as it does so many other devices on the internet. Now, what this means is that you don't have to probe that IP address in order to try and establish whether the device is a honeypot or not. Now, just for context, let me show you what is actually on that IP address. We'll go back to Shodan's normal search page, and I'll search for the same IP. And here it is. And what you'll notice here is that this is the Dioneia honeypot. So this is actually broadcasting itself as being a honeypot. And Dioneia is simply a popular open source honeypot product. We can see that this particular instance of it is running over in the UK. Obviously, this is a pretty simplistic example because the device is actually broadcasting the fact that it's a honeypot. But it's not always quite that obvious. Let me give you another example. This is the website for the Honeypot Honeypot project. Now, this is developed under the guidance of the Honeynet project. We'll have a look at that a little bit later. The thing about Honeypot, though, is that it's specifically designed to emulate industrial control systems, so devices such as SCADA systems. So now we're talking about systems which can manage everything from water filtration plants to airports to nuclear power stations. Honeypot is the Open Industrial Control Honeypot, hence the Honeypot name. You can go and grab a copy of Honeypot and stand up your own honeypot, which makes it look like it is actually an industrial control system. This is the sort of system that stood up facing the public internet. But depending on how you configure Honeypot, there can be a bit of a problem. Let's go back to Shodan and I'll show you what I mean. Back in Shodan, I'm going to do a very particular search. I'm going to paste it in here from my clipboard. Serial number of module, and then we've got a number afterwards which looks like a serial number. Let's do a search for this. Shodan has found 135 results. And these results are predominantly US centric, but there's a bunch of them spread out around the world. Let's just drill down on this first one. Here we have a device that suggests it's made by Siemens. Now Siemens make industrial control systems such as SCADA systems to perform the sorts of roles I just mentioned. And in this case we can see what it's identifying itself as, and we can see the serial number of it as well. That's the one that I just searched for. Let's have a look at what this is actually meant to be. So here is what this internet-connected device is pretending to be. However, we know that it is not this device, because the search we just did on Shodan is for the serial number which is the default value of a Honeypot honeypot device. So we've just been able to detect a whole bunch of honeypots, not by probing away at them at all, but simply by searching for information which they're already broadcasting and has been indexed by Shodan as a search engine for internet-connected devices. Now, of course, this approach only works when the device is publicly facing and it's been indexed by Shodan. But hopefully it gives you a bit of an idea of how a honeypot can be detected based on the information that it's broadcasting. If Honeypot was configured more optimally, in the case of those machines that were found in the Shodan search, it may actually be very difficult. Shodan itself may not know what the device is, at least not without further probing. And yes, that would trigger alerts on the honeypot, but they're being triggered by a search engine, not by an individual attacker. Of course, the whole story is very different once the honeypot is inside a network and it's not discoverable via a service such as Shodan. But hopefully it gives you a bit of an idea about how these devices broadcast their identities and how they might be discovered and their true intention revealed by a service like Shodan. I want to look at one more thing in this module, and that's some really useful additional resources on honeypots. I've touched on a few different honeypot products already in this module, but rather than now drill down and show you individual tools that may be relevant today but possibly not in the future when you may be watching this course, I wanted to share a couple of resources that are maintained very well and have some really comprehensive lists of other resources that can be extremely useful. And this is one of them, a GitHub project with a really comprehensive list of, as the title says, awesome honeypots. Now this is great because it's a maintained list. You should be able to come back to this in the future and see what is still relevant. So as it suggests here in this section, we've got honeypots, HoneyD tools, we looked at HoneyD earlier on, some network and artifact analysis, data tools and guides. And as we scroll down through this list, you'll get a sense of just how comprehensive it is. This is a really comprehensive list of resources, and much of what we've already looked at in this module is captured here on the links I'm paging through now. This is a great resource for more information, and being a curated list, it should also stay up to date and be relevant into the future as well. So definitely check out this GitHub project. Let me show you one other resource. This is the Honeynet project, and it was under their umbrella that the Honeypot project we saw just before was created. So this was the one that emulates industrial control systems. The Honeypot project is a not-for-profit security research organisation, and they've got a heap of really great resources here, as well as a strong community around creating really innovative projects. You can find a bunch of those listed here under the projects link. And if you're interested in going deeper into honeypots, it's really worth having a scroll through this list. They're involved in some really interesting work. There are some really good community initiatives aimed at creating honeypots to better understand the way attackers work. Not just honeypots that run in internal organisations like a Canary, but rather open source projects that run out there facing the public internet so that we can better understand, as a security community, how attackers are breaking into our systems. There's some really great work here, both by the Honeynet project and by other groups trying to make a positive difference to web security. So there are a couple of really useful additional resources. Let's now move on and summarize the module. Let's summarize the module and indeed the course. And one of the things I hope you've picked up on in this Honeypot module is just how broad the range of Honeypot projects and services are. We looked at some great free and open source projects such as HoneyD and Conpot, services such as Project Honeypot in order to try and identify where spam is coming from, Honey Tokens, courtesy of canarytokens.org, and of course their partner commercial project, the Canary device that you plug into a network. All of these have a common objective of identifying potentially malicious traffic. And the common thread they have is being indistinguishable from legitimate machines. Or in the case of something like Project Honeypot with their email addresses or Canary tokens with their unique strings, indistinguishable from legitimate emails or URLs. This is really the value proposition of the Honeypot. Sit there, look like a legitimate machine, and wait for someone to connect. Now, of course, once they do connect, it may be possible to identify that it is a honeypot, particularly if it's a low interaction honeypot. But by then it's too late because once you're connected, it's triggered the alert. And that's exactly why the honeypot is there in the first place, to wait for people to connect. Or to use the email address or use the token. It's the same premise. It's a bait that's sitting out there waiting for the adversary to take it. And finally, as I mentioned when I was talking about some of those additional resources, the Honeynet project in particular, honeypots are providing invaluable research. We can learn a huge amount about how adversaries compromise systems by observing how they behave in honeypots. There's some great honeypot projects out there, and many of them are contributing back to common knowledge bases that help us all better secure our systems. That's everything I'd like to cover on honeypots, and indeed that wraps up the course. This has been Evading IDS, Firewalls and Honeypots. I'm Troy Hunt. Thank you for watching the course.